My name is Mark Harvey, and I got my PhD from KU. I have taught for the University of St. Mary for 13 years now. I run the MBA program there, and my actual area of expertise, or my PhD area, is in political science, but I actually run a business program, which is a little bit weird, except that, part of my areas of exploration was international political economy, and also I ran a small business. I was a business consultant for years, and so it worked out for me to sort of teach things like global management, and so kind of got into the business stuff on that side. So, and then my research area, this whole business about celebrities, really, is a nice crossing of the two fields as well, because you have an entertainment industry, which is essentially a business entity where they're making lots of money and they have these profit motives, but at the same time there's incredible impact on, at least potential anyway, on people's political attitudes. And so I like the way those two things were sort of brought together. As for what brought me to this topic in the first place, I also am a musician, and I perform, stuff, and I've kind of, and I'm kind of a music freak. Like I know like every little stupid trivial detail about rock history and stuff like that. And so I became interested in the way that some of these musicians would be able to mesmerize their crowds, basically, and influence them with political messaging. And so I thought, I don't know why I don't just do this as a PhD topic, and so I did. But there was some real challenges, though, in that, like, at the time that I was working on that, nobody was taking me seriously. It's something I really had to fight for, because, you had most people in the field who are like, well, why is anybody going to listen to these celebrities anyway? Nobody really cares, to the extent that they're talking. Maybe it's obvious what their impact is. And so I had to make a real case that this actually was a legitimate field of study. At least in the 20th century, the earliest celebrity involvement, anyway, in terms of political endorsement was Al Jolson back in, I think it was 1920. Al Jolson endorsed Warren Harding, and then later on Calvin Coolidge. And one of the differences then versus today is that he was actually paid to do it. He wasn't just doing it because he was like, oh yeah, I think Warren Harding's a great guy. It was like an ad agency basically came up to him and said, hey, can you sing this song? And this guy was one of the big pop stars of the day. Everybody knew Al Jolson. He was the most famous dude around. And so, whether or not it made a difference in the election, I don't know. I mean, clearly the guy won, but it wasn't like somebody just coming in and saying, okay, well, I feel passionate about this. It was somebody from the campaign contacting an ad agency and getting somebody involved like that. So it's a different kind of a thing. Later on in the 20th century, you have somebody like Frank Sinatra who gets politically involved. Very famous guy, of course. Ad agency doesn't call him. He just has opinions, right? So, and he's big enough that people actually start paying attention to his opinions. Now, not that he's swaying anybody's opinion, but first he endorses FDR, and that gets enough attention from congressional Republicans who are basically saying, oh, he's a mere crooner, right? You shouldn't listen to him. So he's actually getting people's attention, but he's not really, nobody cares that much. He later endorses JFK as well. But what you need to understand about Sinatra is that he was sort of a unique person. There were no other stars out there doing endorsements because there were real limitations in terms of what they were able to do in terms of their contract. So if you were a Hollywood star, you were tied to a specific studio. It's not like free agency today where, like, I can go to MGM today and Universal tomorrow, right? Back then, if you were MGM, you were all MGM. And their contracts were set up in such a way that there were morality clauses. And it was sort of like, well, if they behave in a bad moral way, then we can release them, which was sort of code for, if you say anything that seems to be against the commercial interests of the company, then we can just blackball you and terminate your contract. And so even the biggest stars were nervous about saying things in public because, it could upend their career. And Sinatra was big enough where he kind of felt like, okay, I can take this criticism and I don't care, and so on. But he was very unusual, very unique. Things really didn't start changing until the 1960s, and this is when the Beatles come out, and they become absolutely huge, bigger than Sinatra, right? And they start making political demands on the way that their business is being run. So they start saying things like, we refuse to appear in a stadium or a concert hall if it's segregated. right, which had a huge impact on the way that the entire industry operated, because everybody wanted to book the Beatles. So even if you're in the South and you want to have a concert down there, then you better desegregate, or else the Beatles aren't going to come to town. And so they really went out on a limb, but they were able to, because they had so much money that they could do that. And then the rest of the music industry sort of followed. There were musicians prior to the Beatles who spoke out, but they were mostly folk musicians. And that was part of their identity. For an actual big pop stars that do this sort of stuff that were really famous, it certainly was not as heard of. Things started to happen differently in Hollywood by the late 1960s because the studio system broke down in terms of the set contracts. And so as these independent filmmakers became bigger, the big studios had to then compete, and the basically actors got quite a bit more autonomy in terms of the way they were expressing themselves. And it's not to say they never came out and said anything. There were many that showed up at Martin Luther King's 1963 March on Washington, and at great risk to their own careers they did that. Now athletes are a different story, right? They really don't have autonomy. I mean, look at Colin Kaepernick a few years ago, who was taking a knee on behalf of Black Lives Matter and isn't a quarterback anymore. He's not in the NFL anymore. And it really had a chilling effect, I think, on a lot of people. And so the major sports leagues out there, you do see some people sort of come out saying things sometimes, but it is a much more risky proposition.
Yes.
So one of the things, I guess, that changed is that it used to be that you couldn't freely speak, and now you can. The other thing has to do with the sort of change in the media. Mostly people didn't care that much about celebrities until basically the dawn or I should say the saturation of cable news. So cable news really reaches full saturation in the early 1990s. And now we have a 24-hour news cycle, and they have to fill it with stuff. So they're like, hey, how are we going to fill this time? And it leads to a lot of different kinds of stories that they wouldn't ordinarily report on. And so they start paying a little more attention to what celebrities do. Plus, there's always this, if it bleeds, it leads sort of attitude among the media. And, if you basically have something that's sort of like sex, celebrity, blood, whatever, they throw it out there. And so if a celebrity happens to come out, then they'll be more likely to cover it. And that has just accelerated with the internet and then social media, where it isn't just a 24-hour media cycle. It's like I'm bored and now I'm clicking something. And so if I'm a media organization and I have to get somebody's attention and I have to compete with everything else out there, if I can find a celebrity advocating for something, then whoosh, here I am, man. I'm hoping that's clickbait to get them to pay attention to me. So that's a huge difference from the days when there were just like 3 networks and people were mostly reporting the news because there was a limited amount of time, and they tried to make good use of that time in a different way. It's not like the media is totally sold out and says that, we don't think that the news is important anymore. But by tagging a celebrity onto a news item, then you're more likely to get people to pay attention to that news item, or so the story goes. As we've become more polarized, it's pretty clear that people want a connection between their celebrities and whatever it is they believe in. In fact, I'll just speak as a business professor for a second, is the same thing is happening with our branding as well, is that those brands that we buy from, we want to feel like they're doing good things. And so corporate social responsibility has been a major, is really accelerated quite a bit, in part because people do care about that stuff. Now, the problem with both businesses and celebrities, both being essentially brands, is that when you do take sides, then there is a commercial risk, just like there was in the 1940s or any other time, right? So you have to kind of calculate that out. It's like, is it worth my speaking out if it means that I'm going to alienate some of my fan base? And a great example of the dilemma of this really is Taylor Swift. When Trump was first elected, they had the Women's March on Washington, and guess who doesn't show up? But Taylor Swift. And she gets a backlash from Swifties who are like, why aren't you out there? And she tweeted, don't get me wrong, she was like, hi, I support you guys. But it wasn't enough. And Taylor Swift, prior to that time, had been walking that fine line of like, do I want to get involved? Do I not want to get involved? And at some point that year, she decides that she wants to support a couple of candidates from Tennessee. Unsuccessfully, of course. She later endorses Biden and, of course, Kamala Harris, too. But she's made a decision at a certain point that, she's making enough money. She's she's got her own commercial interests. Her family and her inside people are concerned about the safety of, in a polarized environment, of coming out and speaking out. But she basically says, I don't want to be on the wrong side of history. And so it's not just an economic calculation she's making. It's sort of like, I think it's a cost-benefit thing, where she's saying, all right, maybe I'll lose some people, but this is what I feel like I have to do. There's a difference between issue advocacy and candidate advocacy. The research says, yes, they can be persuasive, they can raise people's interest over an issue, and they are seen as more credible than politicians on a lot of key issues. Okay, that is issue advocacy, right? Now, on endorsement of candidates, there's practically no evidence to suggest that they matter whatsoever. Okay? There is only one example that we have where there is some data on that, and that is Oprah Winfrey supporting Barack Obama when he made his bid to become the candidate for the Democratic Party in 2008. And before that, there's no other evidence. In fact, I did a study with some of my colleagues on whether or not a Taylor Swift endorsement would make a difference in the Kamala Harris campaign. And this was before she made her endorsement. This about a month. It was in August, and Taylor made her endorsement in September. And what we discovered, first of all, is that anybody who was leaning Democrat anyway, she wasn't going to change their minds because they were already set, right? It was, as you say, just reinforcing their position. We already had Swifties for Harris, right? And they know where she stands, and there's that. Anybody who was leaning toward Trump or Republicans wasn't interested either, right? I mean, Taylor Swift's not going to change their mind. They might still like Taylor Swift. It's the Swifties, and it had to be Swifties too, because anybody who wasn't a Swiftie there's no impact. But the Swifties in the middle was where there was the greatest impact. So the impact worked like this, where if Taylor Swift says, I want you to go out and vote or register to vote, then there was a very positive effect on that. That is, those people were more likely to want to go vote. But if she says vote Democrat, then people were less likely to vote Democrat. That is, she actually kind of repelled people. And so it's not intuitive. It's not exactly what you would expect. But there are a lot of people out there who are like, I don't want my celebrity mixed in my politics. And one of the reasons why I think that endorsing candidates and endorsing issues are different is based on some evidence that I gathered when looking at the impact of issues. And that is that what I found is that celebrities could not persuade people on issues that were highly polemic. So like if you talk about, like Taylor Swift is not going to convince anybody to give up their guns, change their mind on abortion, right? Those issues, they're stuck. Nobody's going to change their mind. There has to be a major change in public opinion, probably in some other way. Celebrity's not going to do that, right? And when you're looking at candidates in today's polarized society, people are looking at candidates very much like they are those polemic issues. And so you're not going to change a Trump voter's mind. You're not going to change a Kamala Harris voter's mind. I do think that when they come out and start advocating for things that are more polemic, or they start advocating for candidates, then you do have a potential to have sort of a knee-jerk reaction in the way that I described. But the other thing is that, keep in mind, is that celebrities can't just advocate for any issue anytime, and some do better at it than others. So there was a study done in the sort of mid-2000s or something like that about Jessica Simpson. I don't know if you're familiar, remember Jessica Simpson or not, but singer, actress, the whole thing. They did a study on her, hypothetically, on whether or not she could sell different kinds of products. And what they discovered is she was very good at selling perfume and not at all good at selling pocket knives. Right? Now, intuitively, that probably makes sense. It's like, but what the advertising literature suggests is that there has to be a brand match, that, you have to find, and keep in mind that a lot of celebrity advertising campaigns are completely unsuccessful. They do a bad job. But that's the key, is making sure that you have a brand match. And so some celebrities, when they come out and advocate for certain issues, are not necessarily a good brand match. Like if there's somebody, say, I'm going to pick out Justin Bieber, for example, right? Justin Bieber comes out and starts talking about politics. Is anybody going to pay that much attention? they might pay attention, but it probably isn't going to sway anybody, right? But you take somebody like Bono from U2 or Angelina Jolie, who has lots of experience and involvement in the UN as an ambassador, those people who have surrounded themselves with advocacy organizations and experts and have training and so on are tended to be taken quite a bit more seriously than somebody who just says, "Hi, I have an opinion today." And so
Right.
there's a little bit of difference. And so, it isn't just that people are reacting for or against somebody in general. It's also that there's sometimes that perception and reaction has to do with whether or not it's a good match in the first place. And people kind of wonder, like, why did Oprah Winfrey make a difference in this one time where she's supporting Barack Obama? And, I don't have data on this, but a hypothesis is that it might be brand match, is that there's something about the connection between Oprah and Barack Obama and the fact that they're both from Illinois, and Illinois was a key state, and Oprah had lots of experience already lobbying politicians and advocating on different issues, and has, she had a lot of that gravitas maybe necessary in order to be an important endorser, not to mention her absolute fame, right? But, you take somebody like Taylor Swift, and she's kind of pops in and out of politics. Like, not to take anything away from her in terms of credibility. She's a smart businesswoman. I think she's awesome in a lot of ways, but like, today I'm going to endorse a candidate. Well, I mean,
Right.
she, to some people, it may be a little more like Justin Bieber and a little bit less like Oprah. So
Right.
you have to remember that these people who are, making these statements, they're not Al Jolson who's being paid to, go sing a song for a candidate, right? These are usually people who have strong opinions, and they feel like they have to say something, or else, as Taylor Swift says, maybe I'm going to be on the wrong side of history, so I'm going to speak out. And so I think a lot of times, yes, they're engaging in a cost-benefit analysis, but as I said before, there's a risk involved, and so they are willing to take that risk. And so I don't think they're always completely thoughtful about some of those things. Now, on the other hand, there's also the PR side of things. It's like maybe they are thoughtful about things, and maybe they do need to be a little more calculating about that. And yeah, brand match, I think, absolutely is one of those things that you should take into account. It's like, if you want to make a difference, then just coming out and stating an opinion isn't going to be something. So my research has suggested that celebrity credibility is tied to things like whether or not you're associated with an advocacy group, whether or not you've gained expertise in certain areas. And even just like, there's another thing that's important too, is identity in terms of match. So like, I did some credibility studies, and the people who were most credible on LGBTQ issues, more than politicians, I mean presidents, you name it, were people like Elton John and Ellen DeGeneres. And guess what? That sort of aligns pretty well with their identity. The most credible person on marijuana legalization among the people that I basically did the study on was Willie Nelson. Okay? And I mean, look, it's not like he's an expert, but he's a pot smoker, so far more than any politician. He is the guy.